with risk one after the other. First, we'll start with geopolitical risk. Geopolitical risk is in the forefront of the news, of course, makes the headlines every day, and quite a few questions are being raised. We have 4 experts for the first panel discussion. We have plenty of issues that have to be dealt with because political instability is reshaping the world. What is the outlook for 2024? And we'll speak about the consequences in terms of investment, of course, because you are all interested in that. Valerie Baudson, you are the Chief Executive Officer of Amundi. Also with us is Guillaume. Alexis, Partner and Global Head of Geopolitical Investing at PwC. Gomart, who is at the Institut français des relations internationales, and Guillaume Callonico, who is the Managing Director of Geopolitical Risk and at the Caisse de dépôt. Can you tell us to what extent the current wars, notably the top 2, Ukraine and the Middle East, are these conflicts reshaping the world? Well, good morning. Before answering, I would like to thank COFAS, in particular, Xavier Durand and Jean-Christophe Caffé for organizing this meeting. I'm very happy to be able to contribute once again. So let me answer your question. First, I need to underscore the tensions between 2 rationales. The first is the global agenda with the Sustainable Development Goals, which are at the heart of many policies and business models. So that is moving slowly but surely. And there are conflicts which totally rattle economic systems. So we have to wrap our arms around how the economies can grow, whereas political instability is on the rise. In order to describe things quite sketchily, let me say this. There are the US, China, and the EU, which represent more than half of global GDP, and they are hit by 2 major conflicts. Ukraine, which did not start in February of 2022, by the way, but in February 2014. It's been 10 years of war. And more unexpectedly, the conflict between Israel and Hamas with the Palestinian issues that have come to the fore again. And that is changing the regional and even global balances. If you consider things like that, we need to underscore an entente between 3 countries, and they do have a strategic agenda, and they do have an entente. And these are quite significant countries: Russia, Iran, and North Korea. They need to be mentioned because if you take a look at things with these 3 countries, these are the countries that the Western world has hit the most harshly from a trade standpoint. They play a key role when it comes to energy supply, as far as the former 2 are concerned. They do cooperate from a military standpoint, and they are hostile. The Kremlin calls it the collective Western world, and they have close ties and asymmetrical ties with China that provides political support, but not necessarily military support as far as we know. So that is how I would like to sum things up. The 3 key players, the way in which economic interdependence is continuing despite these conflicts, and the forecast that we must try to make regarding the attitudes of these countries that are quite hostile with regard to the collective Western world. The emergence of BRICS or BRICS Plus, does that change things? Saudi Arabia is at the center of the game, isn't it? Well, it's quite decisive because the BRICS plus minus whatever, all the 5 countries of the BRICS that have been organized since 2009 have exceeded G7 GDP-wise. That was in 2022. There's some antagonism between the top 2. China and India, of course. There's a huge issue in terms of trajectory regarding India. Will India how will it use its population in 20 years to come? Whereas the population in China, it has been declining. Geopolitical tension between these two key players, and that should not be neglected. And this BRICS plus, well, could be a sixth country, but Argentina did not join in the end. And there's also antagonism between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Iran, which has joined, so there's the Emirates, Egypt, and Ethiopia. So it's tricky because the BRICS are extending to fossil fuel producers, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Iran. And this will have quite a few reverberations on energy trade and the will to move away from the dollar if possible, and that has been politically announced, and we can already see signals of that. So BRICS plus is very important, and from political and ideological standpoint, I see that they criticize the overrepresentation of the Western world in international institutions. And that is particularly critical when it comes to India. Alexis Crow, seen from the U.S., what is your take on these geopolitical balances? Do you share Gomart's analysis? Well, thank you. I'd like to thank Kofas and Jean-Christophe.
That we're in an era of fragmentation, and that the seeds of this fragmentation were sown well before 2024, and really take us back to 2016 and the rise of polarization within domestic societies. And the first eruption of that and how that started to affect global markets and global trade was Brexit. It went across the Atlantic to Trump. It went and ricocheted across to the Pacific with the US-China trade tensions. It had a damaging effect on trade-dependent economies like Singapore, like Japan. And then, of course, we have this moment of the pandemic, whereupon any proximity of human people was considered to be dangerous. So we saw a complete cessation of even, person-to-person trade. We saw the blame game that happened around the virus. Then we saw a complete retrenchment into national borders in the name of protection of societies. So the onshoring, Bruno Le Maire talking about onshoring, the fact that 70% of French pharma was coming from India and China, and that had to be rectified. You had the same thing with Boris Johnson in the UK with food security. So to be global was to be endangered. We had this talk of de-risking. Then I would say, looking to 2022, you had the dismantling that Thomas is referencing of the Western security guarantee as well, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. 2023, I think we can call, as you mentioned, the BRICS Plus, the year of the Global South. We really saw that at the end of 2023 in COP28, where finally, actually, the Global South was really positioned strongly. But what's interesting is, we've certainly had this challenge to the Bretton Woods settlement and the Western economic logic that has reigned supreme. It was checked by the financial crisis and the fallout from the banks, but it came roaring back. And now I would say that we're in this position where it's being undermined in many ways, but it hasn't necessarily been replaced. So the Global South and the BRICS Plus don't necessarily have an ideological alternative to put forward. There's the mention of the currency, of course. We had this when Monsieur Macron was going to speak with President Xi. We had this with Lula talking about de-dollarization. But I haven't necessarily seen a significant challenge or alternative.
Je vais vous poser la question suivante en français. Je sais que vous comprenez très très bien le français.
I do know that you understand French. Are you under the impression that this recomposition of the world is taking place in a context of challenging of Western values and American hegemony?
And I love the introduction about Napoleon and thinking also about the droit de l'homme, because the ability for the West to stand up for human rights on the international stage is directly undermined by the inability for Western governments to deliver the social contract at home for basic human needs, like housing in the United States, like healthcare, like food, the cost of living crisis here. And so I would say that when we think about Western values, these have been directly undermined by the inability to hold up this social contract at home.
Question pour en terminer avec cet état des lieux pour tous les deux.
Question to both of you. Return to a unipolar world, is that more stable or less stable? Thomas Gomart.
Instable, très certainement.
Very unstable, without a doubt. But what strikes me is that the notion of an alliance between blocs.
Je vois Jean-Christophe Caffet qui me regarde.
Jean-Christophe Caffet is staring at me. Unipolar world. Yeah, he's paying attention. He's on his toes. By unipolar, you mean a unipolar world? Yes. No. So, instability, without a doubt. But what strikes me is that the alliance rationales, or these bloc rationales, are less stark than one could imagine. I think that we're more in transaction mode now. There's destabilization because mid-sized powers, for lack of a better word, want strategic autonomy, and that is to the detriment of well-established alliances. This can be seen in on the Western side, if Western camp, if there is such a thing, and the military alliance, which has been refused on the Chinese side with ad hoc measures taken. That is what we are going through. Alexis?
It's absolutely more unstable. And what I would say is that what's concerning for politicians in the West is this dismantling of the economic logic, and that the economic logic reigns supreme. And here what's interesting is we were talking just before in the green room about the specter of Donald Trump and the potential return of Donald Trump, which we'll come to. And the irony is that Americans are actually economically better off currently. So it's not just the economy stupid, which was the great quotation surrounding the Clinton administration. But what's interesting is, if economic logic is not working, who's the one leader who's figured this out? It's President Xi. He's made a conscious and deliberate turn away from the discussion and the narrative on the economy, and he's focused on safety and security. So if anything, he's been the one to figure it out.
Alors évidemment, le changement, l'instabilité.
Now, obviously, change and instability are important criteria when it comes to investment choices. I'll hand over to those who may help us wrap our arms about this. Now, a question to you, Valerie Baudson. If you consider the current instability, could that consider that people will turn back on themselves in terms of investments?
En fait, si on regarde
Well,
ce qui s'est passé depuis les 3 dernières
if we consider what's been happening in the last 3 years, and which was very well explained,
des différentes
all these succession of different crises, health, economic, and then geopolitical tension, plus this movement towards de-globalization, where everyone agrees that we know what the practical impact is going to be. So considering all that, it has given rise to a very logical and legitimate reaction of just drawing back into one's own domestic market and withdrawing into oneself. So we have seen some capital flows,
flux américains
particularly American capital,
concentrés
which have now refocused essentially on the American market in the course of these last few crises.
un peu naturels.
I would suggest that it is a natural reflex, or perhaps triggered off by political decisions. And at the same time, if you take a broader view, there's been a lot of wait and see in these last few years. The world is going through a lot of change, and it hasn't quite found its feet. So I agree concerning all the uncertainty. There is a lot of complexity. It's extremely difficult to analyze and imagine. So investors and ourselves we tend to just sit back and be more cautious concerning investment choices which are well considered. Now, strangely enough, and I'll conclude with that, it's only when things move that you find more opportunities. We all know that. It's always when one is in motion, in movement, that you find more opportunities or you create them. So in this geopolitical recomposition, where all players, be they government or economic,
une vraie réflexion sur leur autonomie stratégique.
Are now taking a second look at their strategic independence in terms of economy, in terms of commodities, raw materials. And now some of them are likely to react better than others. And that's where, in terms of investment, we find opportunities we ourselves. Guillaume, Callonico, when the world gets a little more complicated in terms of risk, perhaps one would tend to go for domestic products, find funding and financing rather than looking for things elsewhere in the world. Well, given the question, I'd probably say yes, but just to react to what was just said by Valerie, nationalistic policies concerning investment and protectionism, which could be both concerning pricing or not, and more in the financial sector. If you draw up a parallel with our neighbors, where, you know, all our neighbors are now hammering us, the natural or unnatural response would be just go home. So naturally, this withdrawal into oneself is very natural. But of course, the whole situation is extremely complicated, and one is forced to take a quick decision because of the environment and because of the way we are connected with our customers, our suppliers, and our value chains. These connections were a means of removing risks from our investments, and now it's in terms of making sure that we preserve our business models and also our supply chains. So now the question to be asked is the change for investors and for companies. How far are they likely to go? Is the scope changing? And there's several ideas to look at. You have to look at the reputational risk. You have to handle your image more closely. And it's become ever so much more important. It occupies more place now while things are changing, while all the countries are up and running, and peripheral countries on the world economy are coming onto the scene. The second point is the economic factor. The geographical factor is also curtailing certain activities, Russia and China. So there's China and Russia who are playing a major role in the global list, including the tension between America and China. Now, concerning the investable, where can we invest? There are entire sectors that were deeply infected by a sudden and abrupt breaking up between the European and Russian economies, and eventually maybe the Chinese and the European ones. So we have to reconsider all our value chains. As Valerie said, she said that very well, we need to be more resilient, and at the same time we have to look at it from the time point of view. Now, there's instability that's going to last. It's not something that will disappear over a longer period immediately. So as a result, visibility and the ability to forecast is limited. So people who were used to investing and in planning for the next 20 years in this environment where you're in a perpetual fog, it becomes more complicated to take long-term decisions, and therefore one has to define what exactly is long-term. And this is included in all the indices and indicators that you are using in order to determine what the future of the universe for investment is likely to be. And that shows up. If you look at the present way of doing things and the present way of scoring, look at the credit rating of Russia. It's not at all like in the past. Before and after the war, it went down from investment grade to virtually nothing at all. So this kind of logic pushes you towards all sorts of diversified investments, and plus opportunities in different sectors, in different geographical areas, with a view to actually not putting all your eggs in the same basket. And from the sectorial point of view, in the energy sector, particularly nuclear, where infrastructure related to natural gas, and I'm talking here about Europe, are at stake. And also there is a genuine question for investors through the ESG standards, which go back before the war, couldn't really support or assist these ideas, but now, since the war, it would be very justified that you think about them and that you consider them in investing in them when you couldn't do that in the past. So let me just conclude on that point. We are talking about ESG and CSR, but we have a new CSR that is now emerging alongside with the old one, and that's energy, safety, and war. And all those who are more resilient in the face of all these will last longer and create opportunities for investors who are looking for resilience. Now, Amundi has said several times that it's extremely interested in the Chinese market, but objectively, can you be out of it in terms of investment? Now, as far as China is concerned, we have a very down-to-earth approach. We tend to be cautious and selective, but it's a long-term approach. Let me explain to you what I'm trying to say. What I hear is absolutely true in the short run. The Chinese economy, which saw a lot of growth, was based on a concentration of factors, very high indebtedness, and also it became really the manufacturing unit of the world, plus the importance of the real estate sector, considering that it is very risk-bound today. Now, the announcements made by the Chinese economy were based on internal or domestic consumption. And if you again look at it from the long-term point of view, it makes sense for the stability of Chinese economy. In the short run, we know that it's a very tricky situation, and we know what happened with the equity market, and that was partly related to capital inflow, which had just shrunk. Let me remind you that Chinese growth is still much greater than what we have in Europe and the States. Let's not lose sight of that fact. In the very short run, yes, the equity market, the capital market is also underestimated. You were mentioning opportunities, and it could be perhaps useful for certain sectors, for certain investments. And in the more medium term, China is making major efforts now to have value chains in sectors which provide high added value in the upcoming year. AI, that's for sure. Robotics, that's also very certain. Green tech. We know what the discussion is concerning automobile. And in general, green tech is a genuine source of investment for China today. And then also, finally, just IT in general. So for all these reasons, one has to be cautious in the short term, but the long-term vision is that this country has the ability to transform, and there are quite a few opportunities that we could avail of in the future. Alexis, you were talking of delinking, but if you can't completely delink, how do you remove the risk? How do you de-risk?
A melee-melo of decoupling, deglobalization, de-risking. What I would also say is that some companies are de-emphasizing China. And for the decoupling, what's very clear is that there is a decoupling in the economic relationship of the United States and China in certain elements of the commercial relationship. So this is in not necessarily all of goods trade. It's certainly within certain elements of technology, and concerning, actually for us, it's starting to happen in elements of the financial system, where US globally systemic important banks are pulling back and reducing headcount in mainland China. They used to say when Chinese equities dipped that China was a buy. They're not saying that anymore. And here I would really say that the point charnière was Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And that has pushed many companies and investors to be concerned about whether or not they would in turn be under sanction if Beijing's position was to turn more and more bellicose vis-à-vis Taipei. And so that has prompted a change in foot. But what's interesting to note is, if companies and investors are de-emphasizing China, are they doing it for economic reasons or are they doing it for geopolitical reasons? And if they're doing it for geopolitical reasons, are they using economic reasons as a logic behind this, and a sort of a rationale behind this? In our annual outlook, looking at the data through the end of 2023 and the start of 2024, we were scouring data in China, looking for anything where the consumer was weak, and we didn't see it. Retail sales are up, domestic air passenger travel is up, so China remains an incredibly formidable market. And what we're seeing more and more is that if you have a position in mainland China, it's a China for China policy. You don't service the rest of Asia out of China.
Mais de plus en plus d'entreprises ont intégré.
But more and more companies have now included a China plus one approach. So Alexis, from your point of view, does India represent an alternative to China? It's not the next China.
Certainly that is the way that people are looking at it, but it is of course not. Primarily, if we look at the geopolitical sense, it remains a non-aligned country. We saw the way President Biden was trying to force Modi not to buy discounted crude from the Russian Urals, and of course that hasn't happened. Going back historically, India is very much non-aligned and took issue with capitalism in the United States. What I would say for many of the companies represented in the room today and virtually is that India will take us through the next manufacturing miracle, undoubtedly. How long it takes us to get there is a question mark, is one. Two, we don't necessarily see the middle of the manufacturing miracle happening in India. So namely, you see a strong services export from Bangalore, very, very high-end services. You see a strong textile and agricultural base, which is being supported by things like ag tech and venture capital. But if you go back to Shinzo Abe, the late Japanese prime minister, he would go to India to meet with Modi prior to COVID to talk about ways in which India could upskill the manufacturing base to start, to court more inbound foreign direct investment. And we're not necessarily seeing that yet. It's not impossible, but it will take a long time.
Même question pour nos deux investisseurs, Guillaume.
Same question for Guillaume. Callonico, is that a credible alternative to China? Well, I think I'd have a different approach to India as to China. To begin with, it has its advantages. It's this biggest country in terms of demographic growth for the next 30 or 50 years, which is no longer the case of China and no longer Brazil and Mexico, the other two emergings, which are stagnating in terms of population growth. So expected growth. And second factor of growth is the middle classes, which is growing, very relevant, especially in terms of consumption for investment. Plus, investment rates are likely to double. So that's a third factor of interesting growth that we no longer find in the Chinese economy. And then last point, and even if it does take place at a very local level, and I agree with Alexis that it's not tomorrow's China's, there's this nearshoring or mutualizing or pooling of resources, and that India is likely to capture. There are certain sectors which are extremely growing, and Modi is pushing it, whether you like it or not. They run a few risks, but I can give you figures to prove this to you, that the Indian system is undergoing a major revolution in terms of infrastructure. More roadways and highways were built and rail tracks during 9 years of Modi than in the last 70 years of independence of India. So that just gives you an idea of the magnitude on which infrastructural changes are taking place to make sure that this demographic and other growth will take place and this move towards urbanization. And naturally, everything related to consumption, infrastructure, and real estate are very promising sectors for those who wish to be present in these markets. However, they all bear certain specific specific risks, which are typically India, which you don't find in China. Firstly, let's say it clearly. It's not a completely liberal economy. It's an extremely protectionist country, and it is going to remain like that for some time. So if you go to India, it's not for exporting. It is to do make in India. Plus, their culture of writing cost contracts is very different from what we have in the West. So one must get used to it. And then risks are not managed at a federal level. There are several at a local level, so you have to handle that. I'm talking of CSR. I'm talking of the first CSR that we are used to. Plus, there are certain political practices that is the Modi government, which are more and more hybrid and which seem to be almost authoritarian, like you see in Turkey, as we saw early 2000s and 2010, or other countries which have moved from democracy towards this kind of hybrid regime. This bears certain risks and challenges for investment, particularly the independence of central banks and the local currency. This might happen in India concerning the central bank. So there are certain risks. They have to be considered, but there are quite a few advantages that other emergents don't have.
Valerie, what's your vision about the strategy of investments in India?
Je partage tout ce qui a été.
Well, I concur with what has been said up to now, and globally I have a rather positive vision regarding investment in India. It is difficult to compare both countries, their models, their future. There are a lot of difference between the two. So should we replace one by the other, it's out of the question. But whether India is an opportunity for investment in the long term, the answer is yes. Why so? Because there are several factors that are extremely favorable. If I pick three that I visualized, that are already quoted, demography is obvious. And objectively, it's a source of economic growth. And the very large infrastructure projects that you quoted, and the trend to urbanization, which has a very strong impact in India, and the wealth of the middle class. Just to tell about an anecdote, we have a very important joint venture with SBI, the first Indian bank. We start this investment management market together in India. Today, we have the first asset manager there. We have 17% of market share, 17. We deal with a large part of the savings in India, and the growth rates we see there are absolutely fantastic compared to anywhere else in the world. And all those movements, those positive factors are adding up and will have a positive impact, plus all the others mentioned. I think it is a good area of investment for the future. We understand the risks, but it's and we have seen, true, a report of the outgoing outflows from China to India. It was something in time, was rather visible, but what's interesting me even more so, in the long term, it remains a future. So, Vision 2024 with Thomas Gomart, how do we project ourselves regarding the conflicts we were talking at the beginning? Do we have objective elements allowing us to hope an improvement or a solution of those conflicts? Well, first point, as Xavier Durand said in his intro, we have an electoral year which is without an equivalent, and the specialty of the election in the democracy, it forces decisions. I'm not sure that the election in Russia will have a lot of effects on what's going on. I do not expect, regarding the war in the Ukraine, a compromise in 2024. It is suspended to the and waiting for the outcome of the election in the US in 2024. It's going to be the moment of truth regarding the outcome of the election and the choice made by the US to carry on or interrupt their support to the Ukraine. That's going to be a moment of truth for the Europeans that could find themselves in a very difficult situation, where the traditional forces hostile to the United States and favorable to Russia would be aligned on Washington. We have to anticipate on that in a certain amount of European countries, especially in France and Germany. The link between the two conflicts, the one in Gaza and the one in the Ukraine, is one key country, which is Iran. The great beneficiary of October 7 is Iran, who became the hero and the spokesperson of the Palestinian cause, supporting Hamas and sending back Europeans to their vulnerability, trade vulnerability, by supporting the Houthi in the Red Sea. We didn't really take the right measure of what's happening there.
Plus que des milices désormais.
It's more than militias in Yemen that are really hitting hard the boats and creating a true transfer of the maritime flow through the Red Sea and going now through the Cape of Good Hope. And it has an impact on the logistic chains, supply chains. And they are bombarded by hyper technology by the United States, the UK, not by the Europeans. And the European safety in the sea is really threatened. So there's something very important that is at play. Sending back to the role played by Iran, getting back to what I said first, one of the most sanctioned countries in the world is sending back the ball to the people who impose the sanctions, showing how vulnerable they are. And Israel, Hamas, we have the following issue. It's been staged by Russia. It's double standard. It's showing with Israel that there are some sanctions taken for several countries, but the Westerners took no sanctions against Israel, while there's a policy of colonization on the West Bank. And this has a strong echo with the global South. Half of the global population concerned by the election. Is it a systemic risk? Depending on the nature of regimes. We started with Taiwan. We'll end up with the election in the United States. Taiwan is a good example. I can tell you the outcome of the elections in Russia without any problem. Indeed, there is an uncertainty on the outcome of the elections in Germany also at the end of 2024, which will be very important given the political evolution of the country. And should Donald Trump be elected, options that are totally different. Should Biden be re-elected, showing two things. One, maybe the American elections are more important for the European continent, much more than the European elections. And it shows the centrality of the US because there is an administration which is consistent in its choices. Alexis, the polarization of the opinions in various countries, but in the United States also, is adding more risk regarding the outcome of the US election.
It doesn't just exist in the United States. We're seeing it here too in France with chez Matignon, les changements, tout ça. What I would say here is that what we are seeing is a change, of course, where households are better off. And you look at all of the data, the elevated cushion that many OECD countries actually had coming out of the pandemic, although some of those buffers have been exhausted, they're better off. So I think that really what people are focused on is a lack of vocation, a lack of community, and that these things are actually starting to change the political dialogue. That, of course, as we said, as I began going back to the seeds of this fragmentation were sown back in 2016, that, of course, has knock-on effects on the transnational level. One thing that we were also discussing in the green room before is I want to focus a little bit on bright spots, too, and the extraordinary improvement in transatlantic ties during the Biden administration has been real. And we've seen that play out in foreign direct investment flows between the two geographies and in increased trade flows. So this is something that is, I would say, that is held in jeopardy with what happens in November in the United States.
En quelques mots, rapidement, Valérie Baudson et vous également.
In a few words, Valérie Baudson and Mr. Callonico, how can investors position themselves upstream? Well, the election risk is, for us investors, easier, quote unquote, to consider than other risks because there is a date, a timeline which is known. The risk decreases because we have more and more certainty on the go, and technically because we have tools, financial tools, to cover ourselves against the risk of any surprise. However, what we notice is that the elections over a long period have not such an impact on financial markets, with one exception, which are the US elections, because they do have an impact on the economic outcome. Hence, it is indeed the election that may have things move. We don't know all the economic details of the programs of Biden and Trump. What's for sure about this US election is that the two will have very little leeway, and there will be biases that are defense, fossil energy, and the tariffs will be raised if Trump is elected. This can be anticipated. Guillaume? So very quickly, to answer the first question, elections, there are a lot, yes, indeed, but they are not all as important one as the other. I concur with Valerie from that point of view. In many countries like India, Mexico, it's the political and economic continuity that will prevail. We have visibility in several countries. We have to know where do we have a disruption risk. We name two, Taiwan potentially, even if the same party remaining at the helm, and the United States on the other hand. It's even more so important that one represents a really hot point. It's the Ukraine, and the other one is the main Occidental Western power. On the Taiwan risk, everybody's asking the question, is Taiwan the next Ukraine? You really have to discuss it. Let's not look at it as a binary way, either status quo, business as usual, or military invasion and conflict. No, there are other in-between scenarios, scripts. Invasion of some islands of Taiwan, it has involvement in terms of value chain, in terms of sanction, but no involvement in terms of war. It's less stressful for the financial markets, but it's very stressful for industrialists. And conversely, in the US, a lot of noise like in 2016. Remember, we were told the end of the world would happen if Trump is elected. We have to identify what a Trump 2 could do, because he will not have a strong majority in the houses. Clear tariffs, pressure on China, easy, because the Congress has a bipartisan position on that. And domestic, the president has little power inside. So this is the idea. Thomas and Alexis, you have the last word. What is your feeling for the year to come, Thomas? Everything will go all right. We got it listening to you.
Alexis.
Alexis.
Not deglobalization, but issue-based cooperation. We didn't get to talk much about trade regionalization, but opportunities for companies and investors to pool around specific issue areas, like Catena X, for example, in the automotive space, are going to be very interesting.
Merci beaucoup à tous les quatre d'avoir participé.
Thanks for taking part in this round table. Valerie Baudson,